Hello. Welcome to the second plenary of the 2021 ASEN Conference on Nationalism and Crisis. My name is Eric Kaufman, and I'm a professor of politics at Birkbeck, the University of London. I'm also a vice president of ASEN, and I'm delighted today to introduce our speaker, Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who will be addressing us on the global far right. Professor Miller-Idriss has a remarkable CV, which I now have to try to summarize in a few short sentences. An authority on extremism and youth radicalization, Cynthia is professor in both the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at the American University in Washington, as well as being the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, also at American University. She's testified before the US Congress and given evidence to the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee. In more international work, Cynthia is Director of Strategy and Partnership at the UK-based Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right and serves on the International Advisory Board for the Centre for Research on Extremism in Oslo. Not only is she extremely accomplished academically, but she also writes for a much wider audience in many very impressive media outlets, more than I can mention here, including CNN, Le Monde, and BBC Radio 4. Her publications include The Extreme Gone Mainstream, Commercialization and Far-Right Youth Culture in Germany, Gender and the Radical and Extreme Right, Mechanisms of Transmission and the Role of Educational Interventions, and her most recent book, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to address us today, Cynthia, so you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's really a delight to be here. I have been a fan of ASEN for a long time and followed the work and attended some of these plenary remarks in the past myself. So it's a particular honor to be here in this capacity. When I agreed to give this talk, of course, it was prior to the US election, prior to the misinformation and disinformation campaign and all that followed, including January 6th. So things have accelerated in the US in ways that I think are notable, and I'm happy to talk about those in the question and answer, although a lot of what I talk about today is going to be rooted in broader trends that have been in place for a long time, of which I think January 6th is just one expression. I am going to open my screen here and share it. Hopefully you can see that now. So I'm going to talk mostly about, sorry, there we go. Okay, good. Mostly I'd like to talk about transformations in the scene. I do want to say that this slideshow includes some propaganda and hateful images. And so as a warning, first of all, just as a sort of acknowledgement of that, but also as a request not to screenshot and share these images further, because I do not want these to be the source of additional propaganda being distributed out there in the world. So I will draw primarily from the arguments that I make in my new book, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, which came out in October, but I'm also going a little bit beyond that into some more recent work. So what I'd like to talk about over the course of these remarks is the growth in far-right extremism and terror as rooted in sort of three kinds of transformation. I will talk about the transformation based on what, so a modernization of these scenes and an evolution of the ways that symbols are being expressed and shared. I want to talk about how, and particularly a fragmentation. So I'm still using the term the far right, which I don't particularly like, and I will tell you why, but there's a fragmentation of this sort of so-called left-right spectrum. We're seeing that on conspiracy theories. We're seeing that around anti-vax misinformation and disinformation, and we're seeing it around the use of nature and the environment and climate change. And so I'll give you that example. And then we're seeing transformations, and this is really the heart of my book, in where people encounter, and particularly where young people encounter extremist ideas. And so the example here I will share, but there are other examples, is this sort of shift from soccer hooliganism to the mixed martial arts. And then I'll conclude with some key takeaways and transformations and come back to Q&A. Very quickly, as I said, I don't like the term, even though I use it myself. I think it's what I call in the book the best bad term we have available to capture this phenomenon. But even within the US government, we're not using the same terminology across our own agencies. And then, of course, different terminology is in play across the world to refer to what is really a fragmented spectrum defined by at least some combination of four things. The first is exclusionary and dehumanizing beliefs and structures that situate hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. So that's most typically expressed through white supremacy, but we also have male supremacy, Christian supremacy, Western supremacy. There's hierarchies of superiority and inferiority based on citizenship, which create anti-immigrant kinds of sentiments as well. So these are the idea that some groups are superior to others and that there's a kind of dehumanizing effect from that is what we're seeing here. There are also the other major category is anti-government and anti-democratic practices and ideals that intersects, of course, with some of these hierarchies of supremacy and inferiority around, the failure to protect minority rights, for example, as a kind of anti-democratic practice. But it's also, they're also kind of independent. And so you see, and particularly in the US, but also in seditionist and sovereign citizen movements in other countries, a lot of anti-government and unlawful militias here that are oriented around primarily their argument being anti-government or sort of anti-tyranny as it's often described today. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. That's authoritarianism, rejection of the rule of law, freedom of the press, things like that. Importantly, we have these two other categories that often show up. And so when I'm talking about exclusionary and dehumanizing beliefs, it's not just that they are existing exclusionary and dehumanizing beliefs, but they often intersect with the idea of an existential threat. And sometimes that is also then a conspiracy theory itself. So what you typically see here is the idea around orchestration, that some other group is orchestrating the end of white civilizations, let's say, through what's called the Great Replacement. So it's a conspiracy theory combined with a sense of existential threat. That's what you get in us versus them kind of thinking. And finally, you see violent apocalyptic fantasies, most commonly expressed as what we call the accelerationist fringe, where violence is not just a means to an end, but is the preferred tactic to bring about more societal chaos and the downfall of all systems that will then lead to an end times collapse and then a rebirth into a restored utopian civilization, typically a new white civilization, but there are other kinds of accelerationist end times apocalyptic sort of beliefs as well that rely on the idea of a phoenix-like rise from the ashes into a simpler and purer and more utopian time. Again, not all elements of the far right spectrum will have all four of those categories, but we see some combination in all of them. I won't go into great depth here about the drivers. That's been discussed widely, and I'm happy to go back into it in question and answer, but suffice it to say that there is some combination of structural and system level grievances that create openings. So crises or grievances can create openings, and you do have to pay attention to those grievances. But there are also a lot of individual vulnerabilities that make people more susceptible to the kinds of propaganda that play on those grievances. So that includes things like a lack of belonging, a sense of isolation, even some sense of anger or confusion, a lack of control over one's life. There are a wide number of traumas that have been documented that create kind of disruption or loss or more vulnerability to the kinds of misinformation, propaganda, or rhetoric. The combination that I think is most important to understand in terms of what's happening globally with the far right is a combination of what I call a sense of precariousness and a sense of entitlement. So what we know from the research, for example, repeatedly, is that you're not more likely to join the far right or become a part of the far right if you're unemployed, but you are more likely or more at risk if you grew up in a household with an unemployed parent. And that kind of is the sense of precariousness that I'm talking about. It's a sense that something could be lost, something could be taken away. And so we saw that on January 6th with some 60% of the arrests as of about a month ago coming from people who were not actually disenfranchised, right? One flew there on a private jet. We have a lot of upper middle class employed people, small business owners, professionals, but who 60% of them had had an experience of a bankruptcy or a tax lien or a eviction at some point in their life, sometimes decades earlier. And so that's the sense of precariousness that I'm talking about, some emotionally rooted idea that something could be lost, but it's combined with a sense of entitlement. So it's not, we're not seeing vast majorities of brown and Black people rising up in the US against this sense of precariousness. It is predominantly white people. And I think that's where you get this idea of something could be lost. So, you know, something to which I am entitled could be taken away and given to someone else who doesn't deserve it. And we see that kind of rhetoric with white supremacist extremism that says the country's being given away to immigrants as it becomes a majority non-white. You see it in language and armed protests around Second Amendment rights that Democrats or Obama was coming for their guns. And you certainly saw it very clearly scripted in the Stop the Steal misinformation and disinformation about an illegitimate election that had been stolen and would be given away to someone who didn't deserve it. In this case, the Democrat, the party that then won the election or was said to have stolen the election. So it's that sense of precariousness plus entitlement that really matters. What I want to say about the far right globally here is that we've had a 250% increase in far right terror incidents over the past 5 years, the vast majority of which happen in just a handful of countries. And so, and really just about half of the incidents as well as the deaths happen in the United States. So the US plays an outsized role in this, but we do see the UK, New Zealand, Germany, Norway, France, Canada, Sweden, showing up quite a bit in the numbers of incidents as well as in the death toll. It now represents the vast majority of deaths from terror in the West, which is Oceania, North America, and Western Europe. This is all according to the Global Terrorism Index. And again, the US plays an outsized role, which was beginning to be acknowledged in the US even prior to January 6th. So in October 2020, the US Department of Homeland Security released its annual threat assessment report, which declared declared domestic violent extremism in general and white supremacist extremism in particular to be the most persistent and lethal threat facing the homeland. So there was some acknowledgement after a lot of congressional hearings and calls for that data to be acknowledged, that's the situation in the US, I think, has finally been publicly acknowledged. And then of course, January 6th was a wake-up call on a whole another level. What I think is important though for the rest of what I'm gonna say is that one common misunderstanding about the far right and about violence from the far right is that groups are where it's at. And part of that comes from pivoting from other forms of terrorism, from Islamist terrorism and international terrorism, as we call it in the States, that did focus heavily on groups where you had, Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. You had groups that were producing propaganda and largely responsible for the kind of terrorism incidents. But globally, that is just not the case with the far right. So it's 13.4% of global far right attacks since 2002 that led to at least one death are attributed to a specific group. And that was also true in the US on January 6th, where you have something like 13 to 15% of those arrested so far were officially, card-carrying members of groups. So what that tells us is that the dominant mode of radicalization and exposure to extremism in the contemporary era and the modern era really is through self-radicalizing, what I call self-radicalizing networks, meaning these are not just lone wolves who are independently, totally isolated. They are interacting with propaganda created by groups. They are maybe fans of groups, but they're not necessarily directly engaged. They're not pledging loyalty or going through an initiation ritual. So I don't want to say that groups are unimportant, but that I think we continue in the media and in the scholarly community, as well as in policy circles, we continue to pay outsized attention to the role of groups while kind of neglecting what's happened in the online space in a systematic way and in a preventative way. I think there's been a lot of really solid scholarship, particularly from junior scholars, many of whom are probably in the audience, about how this works. But anytime you're in policy conversations about it, it's still a focus on the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys or different groups themselves. So I want to introduce this concept of the changing nature of the far right by talking a little bit about the evolution of far right symbols. What we see here is that the purpose of those symbols and codes and gestures remains much the same. They continue to help people find like-minded others, to provoke the mainstream, to valorize violence, to help people strengthen and connect their identity. They mobilize, they communicate ideology. They have always served these kinds of roles, and there's good and extensive literature on the role of symbols in social movements. But we've seen, so the purpose is the same, but the way that they're communicated has changed. How they are created, more bottom up, organically evolving through memes, for example, where anyone can participate in the creation of symbols and iconography instead of just waiting for someone else to produce it. There are new ways that they're shared, evolving modes of communication, a widespread use of wit and sarcasm and humor and satire and irony, much more playfulness in the coding and symbols. And this is over the last 15 or 20 years, so not when I talk about the modern far right, I'm talking about sort of this iteration post, say, 2005. And also changes in where communication happens. So this vast and ever expanding online ecosystem, as well as new and changing offline platforms and where people engage in offline spaces. Like I was saying, this shift from the drunken hooligan scene of soccer to a much more disciplined mixed martial arts scene. So this book that I wrote tracks 4 categories of this. So takes 4 examples to show how these things are changing and what these new spaces and places look like through a lens of sort of what they help cultivate, what kinds of capital they help cultivate for far right movements more generally. So both I look at, so on the lower left-hand side, this is a still from a YouTube video that's a vegan neo-Nazi cooking channel in Germany. That's been studied by other academics as well, but as an example, along with other kinds of YouTube channels and communications, as well as the t-shirts and the branding and the fashion that I studied in my book, The Extreme Gone Mainstream, that looks at the role of food and fashion as a place to cultivate kind of cultural capital, even far-right groups hosting soup kitchens, for example, in several different places where they deliberately put pork in the lentil soup, let's say, so that Muslims and Jews would not be able to eat it. Battles over school lunch menus, battles in Bloomington, Indiana, farmers market, right? There's been all kinds of examples of food intersecting with these issues, as well as with the prepping, the extreme preppers community and other kinds of aspects of that. So lots of ways that cultural capital gets cultivated here. We see targeting of higher education, particularly in the US, although I'd be really curious to hear about folks' experiences in the UK, with campuses until the pandemic being the predominant place where white supremacist propaganda flyers were targeting, as you see in those 2 images in the upper center here. We also see, not just attacking campuses or attacking scholars themselves or students, but attempts to cultivate intellectual leadership for far-right ideas through the creation of what's called metapolitics, or seeding the ideas, the pre-political ideas that will shape long-term policy around border closures or restricted immigration, and ultimately for white supremacist groups, the creation of a white ethno-state. And finally, we see this physical capital, the cultivation of physical capital. And here the use by far-right extremist groups across Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia, and increasingly in North America as well, a little bit, although it hasn't been as well documented, the real appropriation of mixed martial arts, dedicated tournaments, festivals, also live streaming of tournaments, and in some cases, gyms that are owned and operated by far-right groups that that really do try to deliberately connect through lifestyle and merchandise, brands and clothing, but also through the messaging about kind of fighting back against the system, defending your land, and trying to cultivate the creation of disciplined warriors who are going to be equipped to fight the street battles that will precede the race war in the coming apocalyptic end times, for example. And finally, there are real gendered dimensions to this that cut throughout all of these. So one of the things I've often explained is that I did not write a dedicated chapter on gender or on gendered issues related to this in this particular book, because I see issues of gender and misogyny and masculinity as central to all of them. And so there are now increasingly specific ways that women are acting as recruiters in some of these, and as scripters and producers of some of the propaganda and content themselves. We have Instagram channels like this example in the lower right-hand side that are marketing real propaganda directly to women, or using women to market to men as well, that use aesthetically pleasing images. Typically it's a blonde woman standing in a field of wheat, or like in a wood with little light, dappled light, and a deer coming through, but that share messages around, around racial supremacy, white supremacy, defense of your country and your family and your heritage and your tradition. So those are the kinds of messages that are carried through these aesthetically pleasing kind of channels that have helped to also capitalize off of things like Instagram or other types of social media sites that might be more appealing to women. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of the coding here and the way that the game playing works, I want to give you some examples from Europe here. So this is a jacket from several years ago that took advantage of a German law which had ruled starting around 2011 that words and symbols and slogans in a language other than German were no longer illegal. So you could translate Nazi phrases and symbols essentially. And so this jacket takes the German word for swastika, Hakenkreuz, and puts it in Latvian, which for English speakers will be relatively obvious because swastika sounds like swastika. Hakenkreuz, if you put the German word up there, that would be illegal. You cannot put that word on a t-shirt or jacket or something. Can't put the symbol or the word. So in it, it's, first of all, it's like 76 euro, right? So that's pretty expensive for just a sweatshirt, a zippy sweatshirt. But when you see the high quality of it, and in the marketing text on the right, for those of you who speak German, you'll see that it says, not only tells you about like the quality of the zipper and the cotton and how great it is, but the very first line says rechtlich absolut unbedenklich, which means perfectly legal. So it's marketing the legality of that phrase very much to the consumer themselves. We began to see similar kinds of things with this French distributor here who uses the acronym or coded alphanumeric code 2YT4U, which is too white for you. If you sound it out, you see the word Hitler on the t-shirt below with the vowels removed, and that kind of constant game playing is a real characteristic feature, I feel like, of the iconography in the t-shirts that's coded in the messages that really helps to convey the sense of playfulness, and that then carried over into the memes, which I will talk about in a few minutes as well. But I want to say something about the issue of the fragmentation that I had been talking about. So that I signaled at the start of the talk. So when we look at issues like the environment or climate change, which many people will automatically sort of associate with the left, or think it's a kind of left-leaning political project, what we're seeing instead, and this is a quote from an article by Beth Gardinier called White Supremacy Goes Green from last year, which identifies correctly that there is this trend in which the far right has started to pay attention to and really market propaganda and ideology off of kind of eco-thinking, ecological thinking, or green thinking. And so in this case, this is a group that reframed its own iconography with a slogan saying the sky is blue, the land is green, the white is for the people in between. It's an ethno-state kind of group that promotes this. And We've seen this in other kinds of reporting here coming out of UK group, where the ecofascism itself has become a way of thinking about the manifestos coming out of Christchurch and El Paso's terrorist events, for example, that use climate change to justify anti-immigration policies. Here they're arguing it's really a return to this kind of blood and soil ideology of the Nazi era that is in some ways acting either in a direct argument that racial and ethnic heritage is connected to the land, to the homeland, that there's a racial entitlement to the land, or in other cases actually implying that, right? So even if it's not directly argued, it is implied. There's a lot of language around roots and belonging and nature that gets deployed here. And even I've seen in at least 2 different countries, people using the Native American experience in the United States or in North America as a cautionary tale. So really arguing that, Native Americans have been moved into reservations, and that's what will happen to white people essentially. And so white people will lose their territory the way that Native Americans lost their territory. So the irony of white American citizens using the Native American experience as the cautionary tale, but using it while integrated also into an argument often that calls for reduced immigration due to climate change and the idea that there's not enough space in this country for the people who are entitled to it. So it's a twisting of that kind of climate change and environment and preservation language, but we see it in even in T-shirts that are being sold. So this one says, nature doesn't care about equality, be active, love nature. So there's a lot of just subtle or direct calls to connect identity and racial entitlement to trees, to blood and soil, to the ground, to the actual land, the homeland on which someone is based. And so I think it's not just a concept of homeland, but it is deeply rooted in these senses of entitlement. So I'm going to conclude my remarks here by turning back to this issue around the use of humor and wit and explaining, now that you've seen a little bit about that fragmentation, a little bit about the coding and how that works, by explaining how this weaponization of youth culture has moved from kind of the producer, waiting for producers to produce the sorts of T-shirts or manifestos or messages into youth and young people in particular being able to create that content themselves, but in ways that doesn't just stay in the realm of youth culture, but that has also inspired offline violence and action by older adults. And so the first thing is here, it's really important to understand this transformation in the use of humor and wit as one that has positioned the far right as the counterculture itself to the mainstream. So, here, this T-shirt, like, we're not radical, we're just early, but it's this constant framing of far right ideas or concepts as just, first of all, having plausible deniability because they just meant it as a joke. So a Holocaust denial meme that, compares the Holocaust to putting a pizza in an oven, for example, of one horrific example that is ubiquitous online, that people can't take the joke. They're just triggered snowflakes who can't take a joke. And that this serious and boring mainstream is being positioned as against the edgy and provocative far-right subculture. And so I think that has been a very successful, by successful, I mean, in terms of recruiting more young people into it, by positioning the far right as kind of the rebellious and edgy and provocative one that is able to kind of troll or provoke boring adults and parents and the mainstream. But what started to happen maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, is that while we had already been seeing that humor and wit show up in T-shirts in particular and in sweatshirt iconography, and then what I call walking billboards, right, of people kind of walking around with that on their chests, when memes really started to kind of catch on as a key mode of communication online, And we began to see something like Pepe the Frog get co-opted by the so-called alt-right in the States. What happened after that, though, was that we began to see key examples of where that production side of what started as jokes among a group of youth online evolved into offline action and violence. And so one of the clearest examples of that is how Pepe the Frog, through a series of complicated youth cultural actions online, became part of a flag related. So KEK is used to substitute for LOL in online gaming context in some places for online laughter. So KEK stands for online laughter. Somebody discovered that there's an Egyptian god of the frogs named Kek. And so they then created a mythical land called Kekistan, the Republic of Kekistan, and appointed Pepe as Lord Kek, as its ruler. They created a mythical flag, which iconographically is not dissimilar to the Nazi flag. And, might have ended there. It seems like that's just an ongoing evolution of a meme and kind of a joke, and you create this fantastical ethno-state that represents white supremacist thinking, except then that flag starts to show up at offline activities. So we see it in Charlottesville in the upper left, you see it in Brazil on the lower left, in London in the center at the top here, with an inset here from the reporter showing, that I screenshot this from, showing how the iconography of the flag is similar to the Nazi flag. And then in the center at the bottom on January 6th at the US Capitol. And so when you see these images, and when you see flags like that at a protest like the US Capitol, that is a clear signal that a white supremacist ideology is present, that there's a call there, the storming of the US Capitol and the standing on the US Capitol like this with the flag of Kekistan, the Republic of Kekistan, which is a call itself for a white ethno-state, shows how what was a joke online from a group of teenagers evolved into something else in offline space and represents something else. And you began to see t-shirts and concepts, patches and notes about being a veteran of meme wars, as you see it in this t-shirt above, which is just this idea that there is, connecting these memes to political action in its own way, right? And so I think that it's just a really good example of showing how what a lot of people have long discussed is like just kids being kids, teenagers being teenagers, youth being youth, does have this mobilizing potential for offline violence. The other really good example of that, of course, is the Boogaloo scene, which is again, created as a joke among teenagers and then evolved into an offline mobilizing concept calling for civil war. I won't get into how that happened. Boogaloo itself refers to the second sequel of a really bad movie. And teenagers began referring to Boogaloo as the second of anything, and then it became the second Civil War. But the point here is that, individuals associated with the Boogaloo in some capacity were responsible for at least 2 deaths last summer, and are part of this kind of insurgent Civil War-like language. As the concept itself began getting banned, they began using sound-alike words like Big Igloo or Big Luau. And you see in this central image at the top that Big Luau itself was popular. Those are ATF, the law enforcement initials, and because luau's feature pig roasts, and pigs are a slur against the police in American English anyway. And so they began wearing Hawaiian shirts to reference those luau's, which are also then a subtle threat against the police. So again, here you see this language on this patch in the center that calls for Task Force Igloo, meme-based insurgency. So again, something created by teenagers online evolves into an offline violence that in this case really did result actually in deaths. So key takeaways here are that we have seen transformations in the pace and scope of how symbols evolve. They are, people encounter them in different places, but there's also much more organic, a lot of agency involved in how people can create them. You're not just stuck waiting for a few key producers. The groups are therefore in that way less important than other kinds of dynamics in creating some of the propaganda themselves. But we've also seen fragmentation in some of these traditional themes, which confuse, I think, some of the efforts to identify this and make it even more important that we have actually come up with a better classification system and can maybe move away from terms like the far right, which again, I continue to use and don't like. We have real shifts in where people encounter these ideas. So, again, walking across your college campus, it's not just a destination, essentially, that you have to seek out, but it's much more likely to meet you in an online gaming platform or in an image sharing site or in some other sort of chat room or mixed martial arts setting than it is that you have to just go look for it and find it. And finally, I want to just note that, as I tried to emphasize, that a lot of people, including reviewers of my work in the past, have sort of said like, won't they just grow out of it? Like kind of dismissing the importance of understanding how youth are thinking about these issues as not important because it's just subculture. It's just something that people grow out of. And it's not, as one reviewer told me, like any different than him being a punk in the 80s, And I'm assuming gender there, but any different than that person being a punk in the 80s. And I think these examples show that that's not necessarily true. A lot of people will grow out of this kind of provocative meme-based trolling and harassment or doxing or whatever bad online behavior they're engaged in, but some people won't. And in any case, some of those actions are still inspiring offline violence and mobilizing others to engage through these kinds of witty and engaging parts of the sort of meme-based insurgency. Again, that's just related to this broader trend of the playfulness, the use of satire and humor and irony and wit as a way of positioning most of this in some plausible deniability way, but that also tells everybody else they're just sort of triggered individuals who can't take a joke. And that has been a huge part of the recruitment of youth as well. And in addition, I should just say, in addition to, depending on the country you're in, it's not just fun in recruiting people, but also helps to avoid some of the dress codes and the bans of things like school dress codes, stadium policies, or even legal bans like in a country like Germany. So I'm going to stop there and go to question and answer.
Okay, and please put your questions in the chat for Cynthia, if you would, and I'll just pass them along as they come in. And then David, I suppose if there are questions coming in from Facebook as well, we can add that to those. So we have, I guess the first question here comes from Peter Rutland. So I'll pass that over to you, Cynthia, which says, maybe I misread the slide on deaths from terror. It said far-right terror accounted for 82% of deaths in the EU and US. It showed a total of 286 deaths from the far right between 2002 and 2019, but Europe alone had more than 500 deaths from Islamist terror in that period, not even counting 9/11. So that's question. Do you want them in batches? We have another one here, or do you want to just go with each question?
I can just answer that one quickly.
Okay.
Because the quickest way to go to that, I'm drawing there on the Global Terrorism Index figures and methodology. So that includes all of Oceania, all of North America, and all of Western Europe, I believe, are their categories. And so those are their figures as cited in the slide, not my, I'm not a database, I don't build the databases. I'm citing their figures, which come from, I believe in that case, START is their cited source, but it could be, there's two sources that they cite for those. So, but I would just, I can, depending on how much, I can drop the GTI link. It's a free downloadable report, and that's probably the best way to look for those figures and see what the percentages are compared to what the sources that you have are citing.
Okay, Cynthia, we've got a few more questions in now. Here's one from Rachel, which asks, if a young person were to share, say, Pepe the Frog meme because it's edgy or fun, but without really understanding the meaning behind it, could the reaction from authority figures, parents, schools, and so on drive people further to the far right effectively by accident?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that, one of the things that I run this research lab in addition to my own research, and thank you for dropping this. Some of the ASEN just dropped in the GTI report there. So please do download that and look up those figures. I just lost my train of thought. The issue of shame. So we, in the research lab, we partnered with the Southern Poverty Law Center just about a year ago now to start to produce a series of tools for communities to better recognize the signs of extremist radicalization and exposure, and then better build resilience to address it. And we found, right during the start of the pandemic, we were extremely concerned about the amount of time people were spending online and the increased exposure to propaganda that they might encounter. So it was sort of an emergency guide that was created. We called it a rapid response guide. But then we spent the last year revising it. So we've just finished focus groups with a whole bunch of coaches, teachers, mental health counselors, and then we also ran an impact study on the guide. So all of that will get released in May. But part of what we argue in that guide, and it's free on our website, also on SPLC's website to download, is this issue of shame. It's really important to, even if it was intentional, so I would say intentional or unintentional, to not react with shame and judgment, but we urge parents in particular, but also teachers, to try to react with some curiosity first. Like, where did you get that symbol? What does it mean to you? And the reason why is, one, because it's really important to keep a dialogue open at early stages of exposure to extremist ideas. But the second is because one thing we know with evidence is that shame is a converter, that when they go back online in those contexts, they often meet communities again who just basically help them convert that shame into anger, a sense of betrayal, and then further rejection of the mainstream or their parents' authority or other teachers. And so we have some specific strategies that we advise based on sort of best sort of research in parenting and strategies to address. Although I will say, we call it the Parents and Caregivers Guide, because sometimes parents are not the best person to intervene at that, but grandparents can play a role, aunts and uncles, others who might not have as strained a dynamic as sometimes parents might have with teenagers. And so, but yes, to make a long story short, the issue of reacting with shame is by shaming or judging can definitely help drive people deeper into communities online that offer them a welcoming sense of acceptance. And we've seen that happen even when there's been kind of out of ignorance, some engagement that kind of led then to further radicalization. And in anecdotal cases where teenage boys in particular have been able to pull back from it, but that was the way the spiral started.
Okay, and we have the next question here. Sorry to just go one after the other, Cynthia, but that's probably what I'll do. But here's from Graham, who asks about social media policies. Would changes in freedom or policies on social media and the internet more generally help to reduce the expansion of the growth of the far right? And if so, what problems might be created?
Yeah, great question. So, my view on this is that I put social media regulation in the same category as I put kind of law enforcement and securitized responses, which is that they are necessary, but not the solution. And so, I think that we need more preventative and early intervention strategies to reduce the pipeline that leads to that, leads to the deplatforming, or leads to the arrests, or leads to the, carceral solutions. And so on the social media side, I would say what we do know is that deplatforming does reduce the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and it does appear to make it more difficult for groups to communicate and fundraise. And so there are some advantages to it as a strategy, but it also is like a whack-a-mole sort of situation. They tend to just migrate to other platforms. Sometimes, if you've seen Neil, blanking on his last name right now, out of GW, their Nature piece on these, on the kind of way that hate clusters move online, one of the things they've documented is sort of the KKK groups being banned from Facebook, going over to vKontakte in the Ukraine, but on a Russian server. Then when the Ukraine kicks off all vKontakte, they migrate back to Facebook, but use Cyrillic letters to circumvent the algorithms. And so the argument there is that not only were they did they migrate back, but they evolved, like a virus. They got smarter and they created new variants, essentially, that allowed them to come back in and use the same platform. So I think that the way I think about it is that it's important to, the other example, sorry, I'll just give one example of like in schools in Berlin, when I was doing work just outside of Berlin years and years ago, they banned the number 88 from display because 8 represents the 8th letter of the alphabet, for HH for Heil Hitler. And kids started wearing t-shirts that said 100 minus 12 or 87 plus 1, like in a day, right? And so first of all, that was fun for them. It gave them like a sense of power and secrecy over the adults, a way to get around the bans, but it also is just like shows you the sort of ridiculous problem of banning as a solution itself, and the way in which some of those bans can actually backfire. So I think the same thing is true with social media deplatforming. However, what is important about those bans and deplatforming is they kind of set the norms and the standards for everybody else, and they help protect everybody else from the spread of that misinformation. So I think of those strategies as a strategy to help the mainstream, but not a strategy to actually diminish the extremist fringe. So, because I think in some cases it backfires and makes the extremist fringe even smarter, or just goes into darker places that are more encrypted or anonymized spaces that are harder to track and monitor, or that become kind of like they move off of mainstream sites into sites where they're really in a toxic filter bubble of negative echo chamber kinds of spaces and voices, where they're not really even encountering anybody with alternative viewpoints anymore. So I think that deplatforming in that sense can intensify and make things worse, but it is still a useful strategy for protecting the potential further radicalization or exposure or harm done to vulnerable communities and to people not yet on the extremist fringe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Our next question comes from Jonathan Hearn, and it's really about QAnon and whether that intersects with this youth culture at all, or is it simply too uncool?
Great question. QAnon is a really interesting phenomenon, and obviously the issue with QAnon is changing a lot of the data that we have on this issue right now. So mostly what we know about QAnon is that they are older. So youth culture has kind of it's not tapped into it in the same way. And so I will say that from someone like me who fields, for years have fielded questions, like sometimes just directly from parents, often from principals and teachers, asking for strategies about what they could do about young people who are radicalizing. Last summer for the first time, and then it wasn't the last time, but in August, I got a phone call from Teen Vogue, the magazine, which, I never expected to be talking to a journalist at Teen Vogue, but Teen Vogue called because they were getting calls from like 15-year-olds who wanted to know what to do about their parents who were radicalizing into QAnon. And so that was a moment of shift, I think, where, we started thinking in my lab about, which we'll be developing this summer now, also some sort of peer-to-peer resources for young people, both to recognize signs of extremism among their peers, but also what happens when the adults in your life are radicalizing. And I do think QAnon is predominantly, again, the stats on this are hard to come by, and we don't have quantifiable, real data yet on this in the same way that that talks about members. There's not really members of QAnon, and there's all different levels of belief in these conspiracies. But certainly what we see in terms of people showing up in person at protests, and also on January 6th, the vast majority of arrests so far are people who are well outside the range of the kinds of people I have typically worried about and studied in terms of extremist radicalization. So I don't know if it's uncool or if they're just not, it just isn't touching their spaces in the same way, but it is definitely tapping into middle-aged moms and into older adults than in ways that we just haven't seen before, and in a much more accelerated way. So where you would normally see extremist radicalization taking years, sometimes people in QAnon are falling in a matter of weeks. So the pandemic conditions, of course, also contribute to that. And I think as we start to come out of this heavy isolation and grief period in the US, in particular, with so many deaths and losses, maybe we'll start to see changes. I feel like it's one of those, like, you're in the middle of something and it's really difficult to diagnose it, but in a few years, we might have a better sense of what happened in 2020 and 2021.
Okay. Well, we have a question here which asks, why do you think far-right movements are more attractive or engaging for young people than far-left movements?
Well, I don't know if they are. I study the far right, so I've been interested in the far right, and there's been more lethality on the far right, and so more danger and risk on that sense. But I would have, and somebody here probably in the audience is a scholar of the left, it would be a really interesting thing to look at the data. But you know, I don't know the answer to the question about whether it is more attractive. I think that's an open empirical question about numbers of young people participating in movements on the far right versus the far left. But what we do know is that the far right is associated with more risk of violence to human beings, right? Not property damage, and that the violent fringe has been growing. And so that's the kind of threat to the homeland part of the threat assessment report. But it's possible that on the environmental or animal rights side, or on the anti-fascist side that we have, or even on the anarchist side, that there has been growth as well. I just don't have those figures in front of me because it hasn't been part of my direct research for this book.
Okay, well, we have a number of different questions coming in now, and we'll probably be able to take just a few more before we have to break, if you don't mind, Cynthia. One asks about, in different countries, far-right symbols and themes are interpreted with reference to specific political and cultural backgrounds. Do you feel that the current development of far-right ideologies would create a globally unified, or to a lesser extent, a more widely influential content of propaganda for young people? So perhaps something on the sort of local context versus the global context of these memes.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I'm also scanning the chat as we speak. I'm just giving a shout out to Peter Rutland, who's already looked at the GTI. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to double check that stat, which I really appreciate. So if to double check where in the where it is, and you're welcome to email me afterward about that. And I'm happy to send you back a note. I did check it and did screenshot it, but I will double check that I haven't transposed something incorrectly there. So thank you for that. And this question about this is a really interesting question about the differential interpretation of symbols and themes. So I think that I think it's a combination of local and global. So one of the reasons I don't like the term white nationalism, for example, is because I think it implies, I don't like domestic violent extremism either. Both of these imply a sort of overblown patriotism, or just that it's a locally situated or nationally oriented problem. And I think it's important to situate this, particularly on the white supremacist side, as a global movement in which they are communicating with each other across borders. They're sharing manifestos and so-called inspiration and live streaming their attacks, et cetera. But you know, one of the things you'll see is, like, I've seen in Polish t-shirts, a Polish brand of t-shirt using the Confederate flag. I've seen German neo-Nazis wearing Che Guevara t-shirts because they think, you know, they say that, you know, they're freedom fighters. They have German neo-Nazis, also far-right extremists, have worn Palestinian scarves or t-shirts with Gandhi quotes on the back because they feel that they are fighting oppressive regimes or acting in a liberationist way. And so a lot of what you see is what I call the kind of emptying out of kind of traveling symbols or iconography or images, which is a concept that comes from the art world. This idea that you can kind of empty out iconography of its original intent and reinfuse it with meaning, or just take the parts of it that are meaningful, like the concept of freedom fighter, even though the image of Che Guevara doesn't fit ideologically with the far right. So, you know, you'll see both. Those are kind of global co-opting of images that happen. A neo-Nazi t-shirt in Germany that had the soccer score set up like a soccer score, 168-1. And then over top of it, it said McVeigh versus US government. in reference to the number of people killed in Oklahoma City in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing versus the US government's execution of Timothy McVeigh. So there you had, German far-right extremists claiming ownership over a national terrorist attack in another country as our kind of win, as a soccer score. And so I think we do see a lot of that global sharing and circulation of images and the emptying out and reinfusing of more localized meanings. But then there are also, of course, very specific issues that get refracted within any given nature. So the far right in Brazil or in India is going to look a little bit different than the far right in the US or Canada or Germany or Norway. We see that the issue of Islam comes up much more often. I mean, there's Islamophobia in the US as well, but the issue of Islam gets intersected with anti-immigrant and anti-migration sentiment in Europe, whereas in the US, Islamophobia is generally a little bit separate from the anti-immigrant sentiment that tends to be directed at immigrants coming from the South. So we have different kinds of local symbols and reality that get incorporated in histories of slavery, of oppressions, and of colonialism, things that get incorporated in different ways into those messages. But I think that it's not completely separate, but somehow linked. So I don't know if that's a good explanation, but it's a combination of the local and the global.
Okay, Cynthia, we're probably only going to have time for one more question here. I'm going to put it to you from Sam Pryke. And Sam asked, the thing about a flag is it's an understood public statement, but most people don't understand the significance of the flag memes taken from social media at these demonstrations. Are these therefore primarily for internal far-right consumption, symbols to bond for cohesion, not something to make a statement to an external public?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite kinds of questions, which is I call it if a tree falls in the woods, if a tree doesn't make a sound, is it still, I forget what that whole metaphor is, but this, there was an article written in Vice Germany about my new book in 2018 about the extreme gone mainstream that was called, the title was many right-wing extremists don't understand their own t-shirts. That was the interpretation from my book. And it was because there is a section of the book that charts out how well people that I interviewed actually understood the meaning of the shirts. And, there are some very historical codes that refer to pretty arcane little details from World War II, for example, that just went over the heads of almost everybody. And who I interviewed, I showed them 34 images. And, so I think there's a question about if someone doesn't understand the context, the actual t-shirt, even if they're wearing it, even if they're waving it, maybe they don't understand the full history of that. And I think that's part of the story. What I did find is that students understood the brand was racist. That was the language they used, even if they didn't understand the exact reason why it was racist. They understood the reputation of the brand as racist. So I think in the case of that kind of meme-based flag, the vast majority of people who see it probably don't understand it. I think that it helps, first of all, it helps observers who say, this was just people showing up there to protest what they really believed was an illegitimate election. It helps those of us who study these groups understand the range of groups who were there and the range of ideologies that were represented. And so we can say with confidence there were white supremacist extremists present on January 6th, even if not everyone there was a white supremacist extremist. So it is an important signal to some people and helps tell the story about who's present at some of those protest movements, even if not everyone understands it.
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for doing such a fantastic job, not only with the talk, but with the questions too, and really rich answers. This concludes day 2 of the conference. And I just want to say tomorrow we have panel session E at 1:30 UTC, which is a plenary with Bart Bonakowski on foregrounding. We have panel session E, and then we have a plenary at 1500 UTC by Bart Bonakowski on foregrounding nationalism in theories of radical right success, followed by panel session F at 1630, and at 1800, a roundtable discussion on regional perspectives on crisis with Lenka Bustichova, Judith Byfield, Daniel Slater, and Miguel Centeno, followed by a very brief conference closing message from Jonathan Hearn with a couple of interesting announcements. You will be emailed all the links you need. You can find them all on the website. We hope you've enjoyed today's session, and we greatly look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you once again, Cynthia.
Thank you. And thank you, Peter Rutland, for finding the citation on page 60. So I really appreciate the side chat about that stat. And thank you, everyone, for listening, and be safe and well.
Fantastic. Bye-bye.